A daughter is never supposed to become currency, but in one moment, she was traded like a debt no one wanted to carry. Ariana Vale had always believed her life was defined by structure, not chaos. Her world had boundaries, rules, expectations that were enforced long before she ever questioned them. Raised in a controlled environment, she grew up under the watchful authority of her father, Marcus Vale, a man whose presence filled every room long before he spoke a word. He was not the type of father who expressed warmth openly. Instead, his protection came through restrictions, limits, silent commands that shaped her life into something predictable, if not entirely comfortable. Ariana had learned to adapt to that environment. She understood early that freedom was not something granted. It was something carefully negotiated and often denied. But within those limitations, she built something of her own, a quiet strength, a sense of identity, a belief that even if her world was controlled, her mind was still her own. To the outside world, Marcus Vale appeared as a successful, disciplined man, respected, controlled, a figure who operated within high-level business circles, known for his precision and unshakable composure. But beneath that surface, there were gaps, moments Ariana never fully understood, late-night calls that were never explained, private meetings that required silence, and an unspoken rule within the household. Certain things were never questioned. At first, she accepted it. She believed it was part of who he was, part of what made him capable. But over time, those silent gaps began to feel heavier, like something was being hidden, something important, something dangerous. The truth remained just beyond her reach. Until the moment everything shifted. Marcus Vale was not careless. He was calculated, which meant when he began to show signs of instability, something was already deeply wrong. Ariana didn't notice it immediately, but gradually, the changes became undeniable. Longer silences, tighter expressions, subtle tension that lingered in the air even when nothing was being said. The control that once defined him began to show cracks. And those cracks had a cause, a hidden financial crisis, one that wasn't visible on the surface, but one that carried enough weight to threaten everything he had built. Marcus Vale had built his life on control. Control over business, control over people, control over information. But now, that control was slipping. And for someone like him, loss of control was not an option. Ariana remained unaware of the full extent of the situation. She only sensed a shift, a growing tension, a pressure she couldn't define. But what she didn't know was that her father was already making decisions that would change her life forever. Marcus had entered a world he had always operated alongside, but never fully belonged to. A hidden network, a system that existed beneath the surface of society, where power was not defined by status, but by influence. And in that world, people were not always treated as individuals. Sometimes they were treated as assets, negotiable, exchangeable, replaceable. Marcus Vale had reached a point where options were limited, and desperation, for a man like him, was dangerous, not just to himself, but to everything he claimed to protect. He made a decision, quiet, calculated, final. A deal was arranged, not through open discussion, but through silence. A transaction that would never be recorded in public records. A transaction that did not involve money alone, because in that world, some debts were paid in ways that could not be measured by numbers. Ariana became part of that equation, not because she was chosen randomly, but because she was accessible, available, and most importantly, valuable. The betrayal did not come with warning. There was no confrontation, no explanation, no opportunity to resist. Ariana's life shifted in an instant. She was taken without understanding why, moved under false pretenses, led into a situation that appeared controlled, organized, but unfamiliar. The people around her did not act like rescuers. They did not speak with compassion. They did not offer clarity. Instead, there was silence, observation, control, and that was when something began to feel wrong. Ariana's instincts sharpened. Something about the situation did not align. The environment felt different, not like anything she had experienced before. There was structure, but not safety, movement, but not freedom, and presence, but not humanity in the way she understood it. Then came the realization, slow, unwelcome, but undeniable. She was not being protected. She was not being relocated for safety. She was being transferred, handled, moved like something that held value. Her confusion deepened as pieces began to align. The silence, the lack of explanation, the controlled environment, the absence of any meaningful resistance. It was not an accident. It was intentional. And the truth was far more disturbing than anything she had considered before. Ariana was no longer part of a normal system. She had been placed into something hidden, something structured, something powerful, a network that operated beneath society's awareness, where human lives were not always treated with the dignity she believed they deserved. Instead, they were categorized, assessed, and sometimes acquired. The weight of that realization did not come all at once. It built slowly, until it became impossible to ignore. Ariana's heart began to tighten as she understood what was happening, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. She had been removed from her life, from her control, from her identity, and placed into a system where she no longer had the same rights she once took for granted. And then, the truth settled in fully. She had been sold, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally, transferred from one form of control to another. Her mind struggled to process it, because it conflicted with everything she believed about her father. Marcus Vale had always been controlling, strict, distant, but protective. At least, that was what she believed. Now, that belief fractured, because the only person who had the power to make this decision was him, and he had made it without telling her, without warning, without giving her a chance to understand. The emotional impact was immediate. Confusion, shock, fear. But beneath all of it, something deeper began to surface. A realization. If her father had done this, then nothing in her life had been what she thought it was. Everything she believed, everything she trusted, was now in question. And that truth was more destabilizing than the situation itself. The vehicle slowed. The motion stopped. Ariana's breath tightened as she sensed a transition. The environment outside had changed. The air, the stillness, the weight of the presence around her. The door opened, and in that moment, her reality shifted again. This was not just another location. This was the beginning of something far more significant. A place she did not recognize. A place that carried power within its silence. A place that existed outside the normal boundaries of her understanding. Ariana stepped forward, uncertain, but aware that she could not turn back. Not anymore. And as she lifted her gaze, her world narrowed to a single figure standing ahead. A man whose presence commanded attention without effort. A man whose reputation had reached even those who were never meant to hear it. A man her father feared. Dante Vos. And in that moment, Ariana realized something that made her chest tighten with a deeper fear than anything she had felt before. She had not just been taken. She had been placed directly into the path of someone far more dangerous than anything she had imagined, and he was already watching her. Cliffhanger. As Ariana takes her first step forward, Dante Vos studies her silently. And for the first time, the man who rules everything realizes something unexpected. She is not afraid of him the way she should be. Dante Vos did not arrive like ordinary men. He did not announce his presence. He did not demand attention. He did not need to, because in his world, silence was not emptiness. It was authority. And when Dante Vos stepped into a room, that silence became absolute. Ariana felt it before she saw it. The subtle shift in the air. The way conversations stopped mid-thought. The way every individual in the space recalibrated their posture, their expressions, and even their breathing. It was not fear alone. It was recognition. The recognition that someone had entered who could not be ignored. Dante Vos was not a name spoken casually. He was a force. A man whose influence extended far beyond what most people understood. Within certain circles, his name carried weight. Not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it through precision, through control, through decisions that left no room for uncertainty. He was known as a strategist, but that word did not fully capture what he was. Dante did not just plan. He anticipated. He did not just react. He calculated outcomes before they unfolded, and when necessary, he eliminated variables that threatened the stability of his system, without hesitation. Without hesitation meant without warning, and without warning made him unpredictable. Ariana stood still, her body tense, her mind racing. She had been placed into an environment she didn't understand, surrounded by people whose presence alone suggested power. But none of them carried the same weight as the man now standing before her. Dante Voss did not look like chaos. He looked like control, composed, still, unshaken by anything around him. His posture was relaxed, but his presence was anything but. Ariana realized quickly this was not a man who reacted to the world. This was a man who shaped it. Other figures in the room adjusted their positions almost unconsciously. Some lowered their gaze. Others straightened their posture. A few stepped back slightly, not out of fear alone, but out of awareness. Because Dante Voss did not share space. He dominated it. And everyone present understood that. Ariana felt it too, but her reaction was different. She did not lower her gaze immediately. She did not step back. Instead, she watched, carefully, because something about him drew her attention, not in a way that suggested comfort, but in a way that demanded understanding. Dante's eyes moved toward her, slowly, intentionally, and when his gaze settled on her, Ariana felt it instantly, not fear in its simplest form, but something deeper, something heavier, something that made her aware that she was no longer just present in the room. She was being evaluated. Dante did not rush his observation. He studied her as if she were a variable in a system, not random, not meaningless, but important enough to require analysis. Ariana felt exposed, but not in a physical sense, in a psychological one, because the man looking at her was not reacting emotionally. He was assessing her response, measuring her behavior, evaluating her reactions to determine something she did not yet understand. This was not a meeting. It was an evaluation, and she was the subject. The room remained silent, but it was not empty silence. It was controlled silence. Every person in the space understood their role. No one spoke unless necessary. No one moved without purpose. Everything existed within Dante's structure, and Ariana was outside of it, or rather, she had just been placed within it, without consent, without explanation, without choice. The power imbalance was immediate and undeniable. Dante Voss held authority, not because he demanded it, but because it was recognized by everyone around him. Ariana, on the other hand, was unassigned, unranked, unprotected, and now, under evaluation. That realization settled into her mind slowly, but firmly, and with it came another realization. This man was not like the others. The others in the room carried their power in visible ways, in their expressions, their conversations, their attempts to maintain dominance. But Dante was different. His control was quieter, more precise, more dangerous, because it did not require effort. It simply existed. Ariana's instincts reacted, subtly, but clearly. This man was dangerous, but not in the way she had expected, not through aggression, not through chaos, but through control so complete that it left no room for resistance. That realization shifted something within her, because danger could take many forms. But this form was far more difficult to predict. Dante continued observing her, not as a threat, but as something worth understanding. His gaze was not invasive, but it was thorough. He was not trying to intimidate her. He was trying to understand her. And that in itself was unsettling, because most men in his position would have already made assumptions. Most would have acted, controlled, dominated. But Dante did none of those things. He waited and observed, which made him far more dangerous than those who acted impulsively. Ariana felt it. The difference, the depth, the presence of a man who did not operate on instinct, but on calculated awareness. Her pulse remained steady, but her mind was not. Something about him disrupted her sense of stability, not because he was aggressive, but because he was unpredictable. And in a world like this, unpredictability was a threat, not just to her, but to everything around him. Dante finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, controlled, but it carried authority without effort. Every word felt intentional, every syllable precise. And when he spoke, the room listened, not because they were told to, but because they understood the consequence of not doing so. His statement was simple, but its impact was immediate. Ariana's position shifted in that moment, not physically, but structurally, because what he declared changed everything. She would not be returned. There would be no negotiation, no discussion, no appeal. The decision had been made. And in Dante Voss's world, decisions were final. Ariana's breath tightened slightly, not in panic, but in realization, because this was not a temporary situation. This was not a misunderstanding. This was permanent. Dante did not look away from her as he spoke. His gaze remained fixed, not out of hostility, but out of intent. He wanted her to understand, to process, to internalize a shift in her circumstances, because once that truth settled, her behavior would change, and that was something he needed to observe. Ariana felt the weight of it immediately, the permanence of his words, the finality of the decision, the removal of any illusion that she had control over the situation. And then, the second part of his statement landed. She would remain under his direct control. That was not phrased as a warning. It was not presented as a threat. It was stated as fact, as structure, as reality. And that was what made it more unsettling than anything else. Because Dante Voss did not speak casually. Everything he said had purpose, meaning, and consequence. Ariana felt her thoughts shift again, not into fear, but into awareness, because now she understood something critical. This was not about punishment. This was not about violence. This was about control, but not the kind she had experienced before. This was deeper, more refined, more structured, and far more difficult to escape. She remained still, processing, observing, tried to understand how to respond within a system she had just been placed into. And Dante noted that immediately, because her silence was not passive. It was analytical, and that made her different from most. The realization lingered between them, unspoken, but present. And in that moment, something shifted, not in action, but in understanding. Ariana was no longer just a bystander in this environment. She had become part of it, and Dante had already begun adapting to her presence, which meant this situation was no longer one-sided. It was evolving, and evolution always carried consequences. Cliffhanger. As Dante steps closer, his next words shift the balance completely. Because for the first time, Ariana realizes she is not just under his control. She has been chosen for something far more dangerous than she imagined. Dante Voss never made unnecessary decisions. Every choice he made had purpose. Every action carried weight. And every outcome was anticipated long before it unfolded, which made his decision to keep Ariana Vale alive deeply unusual. Ariana was moved from the initial location into a space that felt entirely different from anything she had experienced before. The estate was not just a residence. It was a controlled environment, protected, secured, and designed with precision. From the outside, it appeared as a symbol of wealth, elegant architecture, expansive grounds, impeccable design. But beneath that surface, it was something else entirely. A structure built not for comfort, but for control. Security systems operated silently in the background. Access points were limited. Movement within the estate was monitored, and every element of the space existed with intention. Ariana was no longer in transit. She had arrived somewhere permanent, at least for now. But what surprised her most was not the environment. It was the absence of immediate punishment. She had expected consequences, reactions, control enforced through force or intimidation. That was what her situation suggested. That was what she had prepared herself for. But instead, she was observed, not controlled harshly, not restrained aggressively. Observed. Dante did not rush toward action. He did not impose dominance through force. Instead, he watched, carefully, deliberately, and with intention. Ariana became aware of it quickly. His presence was not constant in the way she expected, but when he was near, he was focused, intent, aware of every movement she made, every reaction, every shift in her expression, and that observation carried more weight than any restriction could, because being watched by Dante Voss was not passive. It was active. It meant she mattered, not as a threat, but as something requiring attention. And that was what unsettled her, because she could not understand why. The staff within his state behaved differently as well. They followed instructions precisely. Their movements were controlled, their expressions minimal. But there was something beneath that structure, a subtle inconsistency, a quiet confusion, a lack of understanding. Because Dante's decision to keep Ariana alive did not align with his typical behavior. That much was clear. Ariana noticed in the way they looked at her, not with hostility, but with uncertainty, as if they were trying to understand something that had not been explained to them. That alone confirmed something important. Even within Dante's controlled environment, this decision was unusual and possibly significant. Ariana began to observe more closely, not just her surroundings, but Dante himself. His behavior did not match the expectations she had formed. He did not act like a man who needed immediate control. He did not impose restrictions in the way she anticipated. Instead, he allowed space, not freedom, but space, enough for her to move, enough for her to think, enough for her to react. And that was not accidental. Ariana began to question it. Why was she being treated this way? Why was she not being punished? Why was she still alive? And more importantly, why had Dante Voss chosen her at all? The question lingered in her mind, growing heavier with each passing moment, because she understood something critical. Men like Dante did not act without reason, and if he had chosen to keep her alive, then she had value. But what kind of value remained unclear. She began to analyze her own circumstances, her past, her connections, her identity, everything she could recall, searching for anything that might explain why she had been placed in this position. But the more she thought, the less certain she became, because nothing about her life suggested she belonged in a world like this. And yet, here she was. Inside it, Ariana's awareness sharpened, because something about the situation felt intentional, not random, not reactive, but deliberate, which meant she was not just here by accident. She had been selected, and that realization shifted everything. Dante continued to observe her, but now there was something more in his observation, something subtle, something that suggested he was not just watching her reactions, he was testing them, watching how she adapted, how she processed information, how she responded to uncertainty, because her behavior would reveal more than words ever could. Ariana noticed this too. She began adjusting, not to hide herself, but to understand the environment she was now part of. She became more aware of her posture, her reactions, her responses, because in a place like this, awareness was not optional. It was necessary. And slowly, her fear began to shift, not disappear, but transform. Fear was still present, but now it was accompanied by something else. Curiosity, because the more she observed, the more she realized that this situation was layered, not simple, not predictable, but structured in a way she did not yet fully understand. And Dante was at the center of it. That realization did not make her feel safer, but it made her more alert, more engaged, and more determined to understand what was happening. Because ignorance was not an option. Not anymore. Time passed within this state, measured, controlled, structured. Ariana adapted to the environment slowly, learning its patterns, its expectations, its limitations. But one thing remained constant: Dante's presence, not always visible, but always felt, like an underlying force guiding the structure around her. And the more she became aware of him, the more she understood that his decisions were never random, which meant Her situation was also not random. She was part of something, a larger structure, a plan, or possibly a connection. But to what? She did not yet know. Ariana found herself thinking more critically, analyzing interactions, questioning outcomes, looking for meaning where none was given. And in doing so, she began to understand something about Dante Voss. He did not act without reason, which meant there was always something beneath the surface, always something hidden. And if she could understand that, she could begin to understand why she was here. The realization created tension within her, not fear alone, but a combination of fear and curiosity, because the unknown was no longer something to avoid. It was something to understand. And Dante was the key to that understanding. The state remained quiet, controlled, but beneath that calm, something was shifting, and Ariana could feel it, subtle, but present, as if something was about to change or be revealed. She did not know what, but she could sense that whatever it was would matter deeply. Meanwhile, Dante moved through his environment with precision, unbothered, focused, controlled, until a new development reached him, a confidential file, delivered without disruption, handled with the same precision that defined everything within his world. Dante received it without hesitation, and for a brief moment, the structure around him remained unchanged. But the moment he opened the file, something shifted, subtle but undeniable. His expression changed, not dramatically, not openly, but enough to indicate that what he was reading was not expected. His gaze remained fixed on the contents, processing, analyzing, reevaluating, and for the first time, Dante Voss reacted to something, not externally, but internally, and that was rare. The room did not change, but something within him did, because whatever was inside that file had consequences that extended beyond what he had anticipated, and possibly beyond what he had planned. Cliffhanger. As Dante finishes reading the file, his expression darkens for the first time, and he realizes that keeping Ariana alive was not just a decision, it was the beginning of something that could no longer be controlled. Some truths are not discovered. They are inherited, passed down not through words, but through silence, through decisions made long before understanding was possible. And sometimes they surface only when it is too late to change their consequences. Dante Voss had learned long ago that nothing in his world existed without origin. Every action, every alliance, every betrayal, each carried a traceable path. And when he began to investigate Ariana Vale's past, he followed that path with precision. What he found was not immediately obvious, but it was significant, because the deeper he looked, the more the pieces began to align. Ariana's life did not exist in isolation. Her background, her connections, her circumstances, all of it pointed towards something larger, something hidden, something structured beneath the surface of her seemingly ordinary existence. Dante analyzed every available detail, every record, every link, every trace of interaction connected to her family, and slowly, a pattern began to emerge, one that did not belong to chance, but to design. Ariana was connected to individuals who did not operate within public systems, not openly, not casually, but within networks that existed beyond conventional understanding, power structures, hidden alliances, underground influence, the kind of networks that did not announce their presence, but controlled outcomes quietly. Dante recognized the pattern immediately because he had built similar systems, or rather, he had dismantled systems that tried to rival his own, and in doing so, he had made enemies who did not act impulsively, but strategically, which made them far more dangerous. As Dante continued reviewing the information, a memory resurfaced, not vague, but precise, a moment from his past, a betrayal, one that had nearly destroyed everything he had built. It had not been random. It had been calculated, executed by someone he trusted, someone who had access, someone who understood his system well enough to disrupt it from within. That betrayal had cost him more than resources. It had cost him time, trust, and nearly his entire empire. Dante remembered the aftermath clearly: the uncertainty, the instability, the realization that someone close enough to him had chosen to act against him, and for reasons that had not been fully understood at the time. But now, with Ariana in the equation, the pieces began to align, because her father, Marcus Vale, was connected to that same network, not directly, but significantly enough to matter, and that connection changed everything. Dante's focus sharpened, because this was no longer about coincidence. It was about continuity. Ariana's presence in his world was not random. It was not accidental. It was a result of something that had begun long before she ever entered the equation. Something tied to unfinished business. Something that had never been fully resolved. And now it had resurfaced. Through her, the realization carried weight. Because if Ariana was connected to that past, then she was not just a variable. She was a link, a living connection to something that had once threatened him. And that meant her existence within his environment carried implications far beyond what he had initially anticipated. Dante closed the file briefly, his mind processing the implications with precision, because this changed the structure of everything. If her father was involved in that betrayal, then Ariana was not just a bystander. She was part of a lineage tied to an unresolved conflict, which meant her presence was not just relevant, it was critical and possibly dangerous. Dante's gaze remained steady, but his awareness had expanded, because now he was not just evaluating Ariana. He was evaluating the connection between her past and his. And that connection introduced a new layer of risk. Meanwhile, Ariana remained within the estate, unaware of the depth of the investigation being conducted into her life, but not entirely unaware of the shift in her environment. She had begun to sense it. Subtle changes in tone, in atmosphere, in the way people moved around her. Something had changed, and she could feel it. Ariana's thoughts turned inward, because the more she observed, the more she questioned, and the more she questioned, the more uncertain she became. Her identity, her upbringing, her father, everything she believed to be true, was now under scrutiny, and that realization created internal conflict. Because if her father had truly been capable of selling her, then what else had he hidden from her? What else had he controlled? And more importantly, who was he really? Ariana had always viewed Marcus Vale as a strict but protective figure. But now, that perception began to fracture, because protection and control were not always the same thing. And in this case, the distinction mattered. Ariana began to recall moments from her past, small inconsistencies, moments that once seemed insignificant, but now took on new meaning. The restrictions, the secrecy, the absence of transparency. Everything began to form a pattern, one that suggested her life had never been as simple as she believed. And that realization was unsettling, because it meant her entire understanding of her identity might be incomplete, or worse, constructed. Ariana's emotional state shifted gradually. Fear remained, but now it was accompanied by something more complex: doubt, curiosity, and a growing need to understand the truth, not just about Dante, but about herself. Because something about this situation suggested that she was not here by accident, and if that was true, then everything she thought she knew was only part of the story. Dante continued his analysis, returning to the file, digging deeper, cross-referencing connections, following the threads that linked Ariana to individuals who operated outside normal systems. And what he found was enough to confirm his suspicions. Her existence was tied to a network that had once intersected with his own, and that network was not dormant. It had been waiting for something or someone, and now that something had arrived. Dante's expression remained controlled, but internally he was recalibrating, because the stakes had increased exponentially. Ariana was no longer just a captive within his estate. She was now a key component in a larger equation, one that involved unresolved conflict and unfinished business. And in Dante Voss's world, unfinished business was never ignored. It was resolved, one way or another, But before he could act further, another piece of information surfaced, unexpected, and more alarming than anything he had encountered thus far. Dante's focus shifted immediately, because this new information introduced a variable he had not anticipated. Someone else was searching for Ariana, not casually, not indirectly, but actively, and with enough influence to matter. This was not a minor player. This was someone with power, resources, and awareness. Someone who understood the networks, someone who operated within them, and someone who was willing to challenge Dante Voss. That realization changed everything, because Dante did not tolerate threats, especially not ones that moved against him. And if someone was searching for Ariana, then she was no longer just connected to his past. She was now connected to a current conflict, one that could escalate at any moment. Dante's mind shifted immediately into strategic mode, assessing, planning, preparing, because this situation had evolved beyond observation. It required action and control, but the question remained, who was searching for her, and why? The answer to that question would determine everything, including the next move, and possibly the outcome. Ariana remained unaware of the full extent of what was unfolding, but something within her felt the shift, a subtle change in the atmosphere, a tension that had not been present before, as if something unseen had begun to move, and that movement was not random. It was directed, intentional, and approaching. Cliffhanger. As Dante closes the file and looks toward Ariana with a hardened expression, he realizes the truth. Someone is coming for her, and when they arrive, they won't just challenge his control, they will threaten everything he has built. He said he was protecting her, but protection under Dante Voss came with chains no one could see. And sometimes, those chains were more difficult to break than any physical restraint. Ariana Vale felt the shift long before it was explained. There was a change in tone within the estate, a subtle tightening of the environment, the kind that did not announce itself loudly, but was impossible to ignore once recognized. Dante Voss did not waste time when something required his attention, and now Ariana had become that something. When he finally spoke about it, his words were not dramatic. They were direct, measured, and absolute. Ariana was being hunted, not as a rumor, not as a possibility, but as a confirmed reality. The words settled into the room with weight, heavy, unavoidable, and final. Ariana felt her chest tighten as she processed the implication, because being hunted did not just mean danger. It meant visibility. It meant importance. It meant that somewhere, someone had decided she was worth pursuing, and that realization changed her perception of everything. Dante did not elaborate immediately. He did not rush to justify the statement. Instead, he allowed the truth to exist in silence, so she could understand its weight. Ariana remained still, her thoughts racing, because this introduced a new layer to her situation. She was no longer just a captive. She was a target, which meant her existence carried value, but not in a way she could control. Dante continued only after a brief pause. His tone remained steady, controlled, as if he was presenting information that had already been processed. Her existence held strategic importance. That was the phrase he used. Not emotional, not personal, strategic, which meant she was not just in danger. She was part of something larger, something structured, something intentional, and that made her position far more significant than she had realized. Ariana's mind struggled to align this new information with her previous understanding of her life, because nothing about her past suggested she held such importance. Nothing about her identity indicated she would become a target. And yet, here she was, placed in a situation where powerful enemies were actively searching for her, enemies who operated within the same hidden systems Dante controlled, which meant they were not ordinary. They were calculated, organized, and dangerous. Dante's decision followed immediately. She would remain under his protection. There was no discussion, no negotiation, no alternative presented. It was not framed as a suggestion. It was a decision, final, absolute, and consistent with how Dante operated. But the word protection did not bring comfort to Ariana. Instead, It brought restriction, because under Dante Vos, protection was not freedom. It was control. Ariana felt the weight of that truth immediately, because remaining under his protection meant remaining within his system, within his boundaries, within his influence, which meant she was not leaving, not soon, and possibly not on her own terms. Ariana's internal reaction was immediate. She felt something shift within her, not rebellion, not defiance, but a quiet realization. She was safe, but she was also confined. And that distinction was not insignificant, because safety without autonomy was its own form of limitation. Ariana stood within Dante's world now, fully aware that stepping outside of it was not an option that could be easily achieved. The tension between them did not explode. It developed, slowly, like pressure building beneath a surface that appeared stable. Ariana did not challenge Dante directly, but she did begin to observe him more closely, because something about his behavior no longer aligned with her initial perception. He was not acting like a captor in the traditional sense. He was not emotional. He was not impulsive. He was controlled, always, and that control extended to everything: his movements, his decisions, his timing, and even the way he interacted with her. Ariana began to recognize a pattern. Nothing he did was without purpose. Every action was part of something larger. Every decision served a function, and every moment was calculated. That realization changed how she viewed him, because if everything he did was intentional, then nothing was accidental, which meant her presence here was not accidental either. Ariana found herself questioning something deeper, not just what Dante was doing, but why he had chosen to do it. Why her? Why now? And why in this way? The more she observed him, the more she became aware of the complexity beneath his surface. Dante Vos did not reveal his intentions openly, but he did not act blindly either. He was always assessing, always adjusting, always controlling the variables within his environment, and Ariana was one of those variables. That realization created internal tension, because if she was being used as part of a larger structure, then her role had not yet been fully defined, which meant the situation was still evolving. Ariana's emotions shifted. Fear was still present, but it was no longer the only emotion she experienced. Curiosity had grown, alongside something more subtle: awareness. She began to question her own role in this environment, not just as a victim, but as a participant, because she could feel it now: the structure around her, the expectations, the patterns. And she understood something important. If she remained passive, she would remain controlled. But if she began to understand the system, she might gain some measure of influence within it. That thought did not remove her fear, but it changed how she processed it. Because now, fear was not the only force guiding her decisions. Awareness was beginning to take its place. Dante noticed this shift immediately, because he was always observing. And Ariana was no longer reacting the same way she had before. Her posture had changed. Her awareness had sharpened, and her responses were becoming more deliberate. That was significant, because it meant she was adapting. And adaptation was something Dante recognized as both valuable and dangerous. He did not interrupt her thoughts. He did not interfere with her process. Instead, he observed, because this was part of his evaluation. Ariana had moved from passive presence to active awareness, and that shift was not something he ignored. Meanwhile, the world outside continued moving. Unseen forces, unidentified threats, closing in. The danger Dante had identified earlier was no longer distant. It was approaching, carefully, strategically, and with intent. Ariana did not sense it directly, but she felt something. A shift in energy, a subtle tension that had not been present before, as if something unseen was beginning to move closer. Dante felt it as well, but his reaction was different: controlled, focused, prepared. He did not panic. He did not react impulsively. He prepared, because this was not new to him. Threats were part of his world, but this one was different. This one was moving towards something he had already placed within his system. Ariana, and that changed the parameters. Dante's attention sharpened, his awareness expanded, because now this was not just a defensive situation. It was a convergence between past, present, and something unresolved. He began to position himself mentally, calculating possible outcomes, identifying risks, preparing responses, because when the threat arrived, it would not be slow, it would be decisive, and the outcome would depend on who acted first. Ariana remained unaware of the full extent of what was about to unfold, but she could feel the tension, the shift, the quiet preparation happening around her, and within her, a realization began to form. Whatever was coming was not something minor. It was something significant, something that required Dante Voss himself to prepare. And that meant danger, serious danger. She looked at him, studying his expression, trying to understand what he was preparing for. And in that moment, she realized something critical. For the first time since entering his world, Dante was not just watching. He was waiting for something to arrive. Cliffhanger. As a distant presence closes in, Dante's posture shifts ever so slightly, and Ariana realizes with rising fear that whatever has come has already been anticipated by the one man who never loses control. The deeper Ariana Vale stepped into Dante Voss's world, the more she realized a truth that unsettled her in ways she could not immediately articulate. Power was not visible. It was engineered, constructed, maintained with precision so subtle that most people never noticed the structure behind it. And within Dante's empire, that structure was absolute. Ariana began to observe everything, not out of fear alone, but out of necessity, because in a place like this, awareness was survival. Her first exposure came quietly, not through force, not through chaos, but through observation. She was present during meetings she was not invited to speak in, high-level discussions that involved individuals who operated on a global scale, men and women whose influence extended across industries, borders, and systems that functioned far beyond public understanding. Ariana watched as alliances were formed, not with declarations, but with silence, subtle agreements, measured exchanges, unspoken understandings that required no verbal confirmation. Everything was calculated. Nothing was accidental. Each interaction served a purpose. Each decision aligned with a larger objective. And Dante was at the center of it all. He did not dominate conversations. He did not need to. Instead, he guided them, controlled them, and shaped outcomes without ever needing to assert himself aggressively. His leadership was not loud. It was precise. Every word he spoke carried weight. Every silence he maintained carried meaning. And every decision he made carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Ariana began to understand something important. Dante did not lead through emotion. He led through control. And that control was consistent. Whether he was dealing with allies or threats, there was no visible fluctuation in his behavior, no emotional reaction that disrupted his judgment. He remained steady, detached, and fully aware. Ariana observed how he handled negotiations, not through persuasion, but through structure. He did not argue. He defined boundaries. He did not demand. He positioned outcomes. And those around him adapted because they understood what resistance would cost. This exposure changed Ariana. Gradually, but significantly, she began to see patterns, not just in Dante's actions, but in the environment around her. The way people interacted, the way decisions were made, the way power moved through the system without being visible. She started recognizing patterns in behavior, in timing, in reactions, and in structure. And with that, her understanding deepened. At first, she had simply been reacting to her circumstances. Now, she was analyzing them. She began to understand the importance of positioning, of awareness, of timing. Because within Dante's world, power was not just about strength. It was about precision and the ability to act at the exact moment when it mattered most. Ariana adapted slowly, but deliberately. She started paying attention to small details, the order in which people spoke, the way decisions were finalized, the subtle shifts in tone that indicated authority. She observed how Dante interacted with different individuals and how those individuals responded to him. Over time, she began to anticipate patterns, and that changed how she moved within the environment. Her behavior became more intentional, her responses more measured. She was no longer just reacting. She was thinking, and that shift did not go unnoticed. Dante observed her development closely because it was part of what he was evaluating: her ability to adapt, to process, to understand, and to grow within the system he had placed her in. And Ariana was doing exactly that. Her confidence did not grow through declarations. It grew through awareness, through understanding, through the quiet realization that she was capable of more than she initially believed. She was still cautious, still aware of her limitations, but she was no longer entirely passive. She was beginning to engage, and that engagement was changing her. Ariana realized something essential during this process. Survival in this world required more than strength. Strength alone was insufficient because brute force could be anticipated, countered, neutralized, but intelligence could not always be predicted, and that made it far more valuable. She began to internalize this understanding, not as a strategy, but as a mindset, because in Dante's world, those who understood the system had an advantage, and those who did not were easily controlled. Ariana did not want to remain controlled, so she began to think differently, not just about her situation, but about how she interacted with it. She started observing Dante with greater depth, not just as a powerful figure, but as a system itself. How he moved, how he assessed, how he responded to different variables. She treated him not just as an individual, but as a model, and through that, she began to understand more than she expected. Dante was consistent, controlled, and precise, but that consistency was not simple. It was maintained through discipline, through structure, and through constant awareness, which meant his control was not effortless. It was maintained continuously. Ariana began to respect that, even as she questioned it, because she understood something else now. This world was not built on chaos. It was built on order, and that order was maintained by people like Dante, but more importantly, by systems like his. Ariana continued to adapt. Her thinking evolved, her perception sharpened, and her confidence grew not in defiance, but in understanding. She was no longer just trying to survive the environment. She was learning how it worked, and that knowledge gave her something she had not possessed before: a sense of direction, not escape, but navigation, because within this world, knowing how to move was just as important as knowing where to go. Ariana started applying this awareness in small ways, adjusting her responses, timing her observations, interpreting interactions with greater clarity. And over time, she became more than just an observer. She became a participant, not fully integrated, but no longer completely external. And that transition was critical because it meant she was no longer just reacting to Dante's world. She was beginning to understand it, and understanding changed everything. But the deeper she went, the more she realized something unsettling. This world had layers, layers she had not yet seen, layers that were hidden beneath the surface of everything she had observed so far. And those layers were not accidental. They were concealed, protected, and likely important. Ariana felt it before she fully understood it. A subtle shift, a change in structure, an area that did not align with what she had come to expect. Something hidden, something restricted, something that did not belong within the visible structure of Dante's empire. Her curiosity grew, but so did her caution, because she understood something fundamental now. In a system like this, hidden things were never insignificant. They were hidden for a reason, and that reason could be dangerous. Ariana approached it carefully, not impulsively, but with awareness. Every step measured, every movement deliberate, because she knew if she was discovered, there would be consequences, severe ones. As she moved closer, the atmosphere began to change. Subtly, but distinctly, the air felt different. the silence heavier, as if the space itself was designed to remain unnoticed. Ariana's instincts sharpened because she realized something important. This area was not meant to be accessed casually. It was not part of the standard structure. It existed outside of what she had observed so far, which meant it was intentional. And anything intentional in Dante Voss's world was never without purpose. Her heart rate remained controlled, but her awareness heightened, because now she was entering something unknown, something concealed, something that should not exist. And as she stepped closer, she realized she was not alone. Something or someone was aware of her presence, and whatever was hidden behind that threshold was not meant to be found. Cliffhanger. As Ariana reaches the entrance, the door unlocks with a quiet mechanical click, and for the first time, she realizes that some parts of Dante Voss's empire were never meant to be discovered because they were built to remain hidden from everyone, including her. In Dante Voss's world, one choice did not just change the future. It determined who survived it and who did not. Ariana Vale stood at the threshold of something she had not been meant to find. But she was not alone in that realization, because Dante Voss already knew. The moment she crossed into that hidden space, he knew, and now he was watching her. Ariana could feel it before she saw him. That presence, controlled, measured, unmistakable. Dante did not rush in. He did not interrupt her immediately. Instead, he allowed her to remain in the moment, to process, to understand. And only when she turned did he step into view. His expression was calm, but his eyes were not. They carried something deeper, something that suggested the situation had shifted, not in her favor, but not entirely against her either. Dante had confronted her before in controlled ways, but this was different because now he acknowledged what she had discovered, and that changed the nature of their interaction. Ariana stood still, not retreating, not advancing, waiting, because she understood something now. This was not a confrontation. It was a test. Dante spoke. His tone remained controlled, but there was an edge beneath it, a precision that indicated the importance of what he was about to say. He addressed her directly, not with accusation, but with awareness. He knew what she had seen, and he did not question it. Instead, he responded to it. Ariana felt her pulse steady, but her thoughts sharpened, because this moment was different from anything she had experienced so far. This was not observation. This was engagement. Dante did not waste time. He presented her with a decision, a mission, one that was not simple, one that required her to act within his system, not as a passive presence, but as an active participant. And the weight of that was immediate. Ariana felt the pressure build instantly, because this was not just a task. It was a test of alignment, a test of understanding, and a test of loyalty. The moment Dante presented the mission, Ariana understood something critical. Her response would define how he viewed her moving forward, and possibly her place within his world. That realization added pressure, but also clarity, because she now understood the structure she was operating within. And within that structure, choices were never neutral. They carried weight. Ariana listened, carefully, without interrupting, processing every word, every implication, every detail. And as she did, her internal conflict began to rise, because the decision she was being asked to make was not simple. It was layered, complex, and deeply personal. On one side was loyalty to Dante, to the structure she had become part of, to the system that was now protecting her from threats she could not fully comprehend. On the other was freedom, the idea of reclaiming her autonomy, of breaking away from control, of defining her own path. And both came with consequences. But that was not the only conflict. There was something deeper, something more difficult to reconcile: survival versus truth. Because the mission Dante had presented was not just about action. It was about alignment with a truth she did not fully understand, a truth that could either protect her or expose her. Ariana's mind worked quickly, trying to evaluate the decision, to understand the implications. But the more she thought, the more complex it became, because this was not just about her anymore. Dante was involved, which meant her decision affected him as well. That realization added weight to everything, because if she acted one way, it could strengthen his position. If she acted another, it could weaken it or expose vulnerabilities. And now, her choice carried consequences beyond herself. The pressure intensified. Dante remained silent as she processed, but his gaze never left her. He was watching, carefully, not just her reaction, but her process, how she thought, how she analyzed, how she responded to pressure. This was not just about what she would choose. It was about how she arrived at that choice. And Dante was studying that closely. Ariana became aware of it, his observation, his silence, his control. And that made the moment more intense, because she realized she was not just being asked to make a decision. She was being evaluated while making it. And that changed everything. Ariana's breathing remained steady, but her thoughts were active. She weighed her options, not just emotionally, but strategically, because now she understood something important. This world did not reward impulsive decisions. It rewarded calculated ones. So she approached the choice differently, not as a reaction, but as a decision, one that required awareness, understanding, and control. As she stood there, Ariana felt something shift internally, a subtle change, a realization. Her decision did not just affect her, it affected Dante. And that meant her role in the situation was not passive. It was influential. That realization created a shift in her perspective. Because of her decision carried weight, then she was not powerless. She had influence, not equal, but present, and that mattered. Ariana began to see the structure more clearly now. She was not just inside Dante's world. She was part of its equation, and that meant her actions mattered. Dante noticed a shift, immediately, because her posture changed, not dramatically, but enough to indicate she had moved from reaction to awareness, and that awareness was something he valued. The tension between them grew, but not in a hostile way. It was intellectual, strategic, measuring, each assessing the other, each aware that the next moment would define the direction of their dynamic. Ariana felt the weight of the moment intensify because she realized her decision was not just about survival. It was about identity, about positioning, about understanding who she was within the system, and what role she was willing to play. Dante broke the silence, not immediately, but deliberately. His words were controlled, but they carried something deeper, something personal, and something that shifted the atmosphere instantly. He revealed the truth, the reason behind his choice. And as he spoke, Ariana felt something change, not externally, but internally, because what he said was not expected. It was not simple, and it was not purely strategic. It was personal, and that was the most dangerous revelation of all. Ariana's breath caught slightly, because this was the first time Dante Voss had revealed something that went beyond control, beyond strategy, beyond structure, and it changed everything, because now this was no longer just about power, or survival, or systems. It was about something deeper, something that connected them in a way she had not anticipated, and that connection was not something she could ignore. Ariana realized in that moment that her entire understanding of the situation was incomplete, because Dante had not chosen her randomly. He had chosen her for a reason tied to something far more personal than anything she had imagined, and that realization changed the balance between them, subtly but undeniably, because now she was no longer just reacting to him. She was understanding him, and that was something he had not fully accounted for. As Dante finishes revealing the truth, Ariana freezes, because the reason he chose her is not just personal. It is connected to a past she never knew existed, and a truth that could destroy both of them. The girl who was sold as punishment was never meant to survive long enough to matter. But Ariana Vale did not follow the rules of the world that had been imposed upon her, and because of that, she became the one person Dante Voss could never fully control. The truth unfolded slowly, not in dramatic declarations, not in loud revelations, but in a quiet understanding that settled between them as the layers of deception began to fall away. Dante had not chosen Ariana by accident, nor had her presence in his life been a coincidence. She was tied to something deeper, something unresolved, something dangerous. Her father, Marcus Vale, had not been simply a desperate man making a deal. He had been connected to something far more significant, a betrayal, one that had almost destroyed Dante Voss's empire in its early stages. A betrayal that had been buried, or so Dante had believed, because what he discovered through Ariana was that the past had not stayed buried. It had evolved, and now it had taken a new form. Ariana, she was not just a byproduct of her father's decisions. She was part of the structure that had once threatened Dante's entire foundation. Her existence was a continuation of unfinished business, and Dante knew it immediately, the moment he connected the details, the moment the pieces aligned. Ariana was not random. She was necessary, not in a way that reduced her value, but in a way that elevated her importance, because she now stood at the center of a conflict that had not been resolved, a conflict that had lingered, and was now returning to the surface. Ariana did not fully understand it at first, but she felt it, the shift, the weight of her existence, the realization that she was not just involved, she was essential, and that realization changed her, not instantly, but gradually, in the way she observed Dante, in the way she began to question her surroundings, in the way she stopped reacting blindly and started analyzing, watching, understanding. She had moved beyond fear, beyond confusion, and into awareness. This was the beginning of her transformation, a transformation that Dante did not interrupt. He watched it unfold, carefully, silently, because he recognized something rare, potential. Ariana was no longer just a woman who had been sold. She was no longer just the daughter of a man who had made a dangerous decision. She was becoming something else, something capable of influencing outcomes. And that was not something Dante overlooked. The final conflict began to take shape. It was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The forces that had once been tied to Dante's past betrayal began to resurface, and with them came tension, pressure, and movement. Ariana found herself positioned within it, not as a bystander, but as a participant. Her role became increasingly important, not because she sought it, but because she was placed there by circumstance, by connection, by truth. And as the situation escalated, Ariana began to act, not recklessly, but with intention. She was no longer reacting to the world around her. She was engaging with it, strategically, thoughtfully, with a growing understanding of the systems at play. And that changed everything, because Dante noticed every shift, every decision, every moment she chose to act instead of react. He saw it, and for the first time, a variable entered his world that he could not fully predict. Ariana, her evolution was not sudden, but it was undeniable. She moved from victim to observer, and now to influence. And influence was power, not absolute, but enough to matter, enough to shift dynamics, enough to affect outcomes. And as the final conflict unfolded, Ariana played her part, not as someone following orders, but as someone making decisions. Her choices mattered, not because they were perfect, but because they were made with awareness. And that awareness carried weight. The confrontation reached its peak. Details converged. Histories collided. Truths resurfaced. And in the midst of it, Ariana stood at a point of decision. She could retreat into fear, or she could act. And for the first time, she chose to act, not out of obedience, but out of understanding. She had begun to realize something fundamental. Her life was never meant to be ordinary. From the moment she had been sold, everything had shifted. Her path, her identity, her purpose. What had once been seen as a moment of betrayal had become the catalyst for transformation. And now she understood that fully. Ariana's fear did not disappear, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, It became something else, a signal, a guide, a reminder, and with that, she moved forward. Her actions influenced the outcome of the conflict in ways that could not be ignored, not by Dante, not by the forces opposing him, not by the structure itself. She had become a variable that shifted the equation, and Dante saw it clearly. The girl, who had once been sold as leverage, had become the one element that altered control. The aftermath settled slowly, not with finality, but with transition. The conflict did not end with destruction, but with change. And in that change, Ariana stood differently. She was not the same woman who had been taken, nor the same woman who had first entered Dante's world. She had evolved into someone stronger, more aware, more grounded, and more dangerous in her own way. Dante recognized that. He always had. But now, it was undeniable. There was a shift between them, not of dominance, but of understanding. Ariana did not belong to Dante, not in the way she once had been positioned, not as property, not as an object of control. She stood beside him, not equally, but undeniably present, and that presence had changed him. The final moments between them were quiet, but heavy, filled with everything that had not been said, everything that had been understood, and everything that had been realized. Ariana stood at the edge of a new reality, one she had not chosen, but one she had shaped, and Dante watched her, fully aware of what she had become. The woman who had once been sold as punishment had become the only person who could challenge his control, not by force, but by existence, by awareness, by influence. And in that realization, something shifted within him, not weakness, not defeat, but something far more complex. Because for the first time, Dante Voss was not entirely in control, and he knew it. Ariana walked away from his world months later, not as a captive, not as someone running, but as someone who understood the structure, the power, the consequences. And as she moved forward, she carried with her a truth that had taken time to fully realize. Dante Voss had never intended to lose control. He had built his world to prevent that, to dominate it, to define it, to maintain it. But Ariana had changed something, not by force, but by presence, by growth, by becoming something he had not anticipated. And as she stepped into her future, she understood the final truth. Control was never absolute, and sometimes